You found the podcast, Go Beyond the Brief, where we take a deep dive into the societal currents shaping our lives. Together, we'll explore the often unseen forces at play. We'll examine the research, dissect the data, and most importantly, if you're seeking to understand what's shaping our society, this is the place.
Wading into a legal and political battleground that you probably didn't see coming.
Not at all.
It's one that pits the whole philosophy of hyper-efficiency, bottom line thinking, directly against the quiet art of international soft power. We aren't dissecting a foreign war or a major trade dispute, nor are we focusing on, say, trade tariffs.
Yep.
Instead, we are deep diving into a conflict where the nation's largest organization of lawyers, the American Bar Association, the ABA, is going head-to-head with the U.S. federal government.
And not just going head-to-head, they're suing the executive branch over billions of dollars in frozen foreign aid.
Billions.
This is a story that, on the surface, it sounds like internal housekeeping, bureaucratic infighting, but it's anything but.
Right.
It's an extraordinary legal drama that is genuinely about institutional survival for the ABA. And, maybe more importantly, it's a fundamental constitutional argument over who controls the nation's purse strings. Congress
or the executive branch?
Exactly. As of early 2026, the collision point between the new Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE as it's called.
DOGE, right.
The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and the ABA has just generated an unprecedented volume of litigation. It's a legal traffic jam.
And it's really not just a spat over a few grants. What the ABA is facing right now isn't merely a cut to its budget. I mean, if they lose this fight, it's an existential threat.
Absolutely, an existential threat to its entire global operations wing.
A wing which, and we are going to argue this today, has been a central yet often invisible tool of U.S. foreign policy for decades.
For decades, absolutely. To really understand the stakes, we have to define our players in this bizarre conflict triangulation.
Okay, let's do it.
First, you have the ABA. For most Americans, you hear ABA, you think of a domestic fixture. A U.S.-based nonprofit, the largest voluntary association of lawyers, and you know them for
accrediting law schools.
Accrediting law schools, publishing rules, professional conduct, and generally just trying to improve the administration of justice within the 50 states.
But that's the surprise element here, right?
Yeah.
The thing that puts them in this spotlight is their secondary massive role.
As a global foreign policy subcontractor, it's a huge part of what they do. They aren't just a professional guild. They are implementers of international legal reform.
Okay, so that's player one, the ABA.
Then you have USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now, this agency was established by Congress to administer billions in foreign assistance funding.
Everything from food aid to...
Everything. Humanitarian aid, democracy, and governance programs. It functions as the primary non-military development arm of the U.S. government overseas. And crucially for our story, it has become the primary target of the current executive push for efficiency.
Which brings us to player three, the disruptor.
The disruptive element, the philosophical opposition, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency.
This is the new department spearheaded by leaders like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Right. And it was established with a singular mandate: cut waste, increase accountability, and aggressively restructure the federal bureaucracy. And they went right after USAID.
Specifically targeted them for investigation, for review, and ultimately an attempt at dismantling and consolidation.
And that's where the conflict erupts. The executive branch, fueled by DOGE's recommendations, attempts to unilaterally freeze funds, to, impound them.
Funds that Congress had already said must be spent.
Must be spent through agencies like USAID. This action completely bypasses the legislature, and it immediately cuts off the private contractors and nonprofits that rely on those funds.
With the ABA standing right at the top of that list.
Right at the very top.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is a deep dive into how the ABA became such a crucial, if hidden, tool of U.S. soft power.
Mm-hmm.
We will scrutinize the specific allegations of waste and fraud leveled against USAID by DOGE, and then we will detail the truly landmark legal defenses the ABA is mounting across not one but two massive fronts.
Two fronts, yeah.
The constitutional battle over foreign policy funding, and a separate but arguably linked domestic grant funding fight. We're talking millions of dollars and centuries of constitutional precedent, all wrapped up in one legal defense.
It's a huge story.
Let's get into it.
To understand why the administration cares enough about the ABA to go after them like this, you have to look past their domestic image.
Right, past the law school accreditation stuff.
Exactly. You have to focus on the sheer scope of their international activity. The core operational relationship between the ABA and the U.S. government has been quietly in place for over 30 years.
30 years. And it's flown under the radar compared to, say, military aid or big infrastructure projects.
Totally under the radar. The ABA is structured to function as a crucial civilian diplomatic arm of the U.S. government.
That's the hidden connection, because when I hear ABA, I think of the bar exam or, continuing legal education seminars. I certainly don't think of a global NGO running legal training in post-conflict zones.
Right.
Can you give us a sense of just the sheer scale of this operation?
The scale is immense, and it's why this funding freeze is so devastating for them. The ABA manages its international work through its specialized wing, the Rule of Law Initiative, or RLA, as everyone calls it. And RLA, in its operations, it's comparable to a small nation-state's foreign service or a massive international development firm. I mean, they operate programs in over 100 countries simultaneously.
100 countries.
Deploying hundreds of legal specialists, judges, development experts in regions like Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe. RLA has been instrumental in shaping post-Soviet or post-authoritarian legal transitions.
That magnitude, that really explains why they are such a central contractor.
Yeah.
But why outsource it? I mean, why not just have the State Department or the Justice Department lawyers do this work directly?
It speaks directly to the constraints of international diplomacy, the concept of sovereignty.
Okay.
For example, if USAID wants to export democracy or train judges or reform a specific foreign legal code in a country like, say, Kazakhstan, or more recently, the Democratic Republic of Congo,
right,
sending actual U.S. federal employees, people carrying diplomatic passports and representing the U.S. state, that can be fraught with political risk.
It looks too much like direct government intervention.
Exactly. It can be viewed as a violation of sovereignty, or even worse, people might think it's an intelligence operation.
So the ABA provides political cover. They are Americans promoting American values, but they are a non-profit, a non-governmental organization, so their presence feels less overtly political.
Exactly. They act as a buffer. The U.S. government issues a grant, which is essentially just a contract for services, to the ABA.
And this money goes straight to RLA.
Straight to RLA. RLA then recruits American lawyers, retired judges, people like that, to go abroad as legal specialists or experts in a specific field like human rights or commercial arbitration.
So what are these specialists actually doing on the ground? Can you give us a concrete example of what All Allies work looks like?
The functions are highly specific and, frankly, politically charged, even when they're framed in technical terms. For instance, in a post-conflict country, RLI might send constitutional law experts to help draft a new national constitution.
Okay.
And they're making sure that the provisions align with international human rights standards and, by extension, democratic values favored by the U.S.
Or in Central America.
In Central America, they might deploy anti-corruption trainers to help reform criminal procedure codes. The focus there is on making the judiciary more independent, more resistant to, illicit influence.
They're essentially doing political architecture. They are making sure that the legal scaffolding of the host country is built to support a system that's compatible with American economic and security interests.
That's the goal.
They're westernizing the legal systems.
That is absolutely the goal. It is soft power deployed through the rule of law. It's an attempt to create a global environment where democratic institutions and predictable commercial law prevail.
And the argument is that this stability benefits the U.S. economically and politically.
Yes.
But hold on. If the goal is promoting global legal standards and good governance, why does USAID use the American Bar Association? Why not the International Bar Association, the IBA? The IBA, being truly international, it just seems like the ideal organization for neutral legal reform. Doesn't using the ABA introduce an inherent bias?
That is the single most crucial distinction in this entire relationship. It's a great question. The IBA, which is based in London, is indeed the Switzerland of legal associations.
Yep.
It's a global federation of bar associations focused on networking generalized international standards. They prioritize neutrality and consensus among global legal actors.
Which is precisely why the U.S. government cannot use them for this purpose.
Correct. USAID cannot use an international entity to directly promote specific U.S. national interests.
That makes sense.
If the U.S. government is spending millions of taxpayer dollars, it needs accountability. It needs assurance that the reforms being implemented, say intellectual property protection laws or financial transparency standards, will align with and benefit American commerce and security.
And the ABA, as a domestic American nonprofit, is accountable.
It's accountable to U.S. law, it's subject to U.S. audits, and it's culturally aligned with U.S. constitutional values. They're a known quantity.
So if the reforms in the Democratic Republic of Congo succeed, they should, at least in theory, create a more stable environment for American companies, not just any global company.
Precisely. The ABA president, William R. Bay, has consistently leveraged this justification. He stated that a strong rule of law and participatory democracies around the world are the preconditions for enhanced global markets and a more secure U.S. homeland.
So they're making a direct appeal to national security interests.
A very direct appeal.
You know, I think we need to push on that justification a little bit.
Yeah.
The ABA argues these programs help reduce things like drug trafficking and money laundering from reaching American shores, right, by strengthening foreign institutions.
Yes, that's their core argument.
But Rowley's work is abstract. It deals with laws and judges. Is there really hard data proving that, say, a judge training program in Kazakhstan actually prevents drug money from hitting a bank in Miami?
And that is the perennial challenge of soft power. It's the exact vulnerability that DOGE has exploited.
Right.
Measuring the prevention of a crime or the non-occurrence of corruption is notoriously difficult. Rowley tracks inputs, how many judges trained, how many laws drafted.
Metrics.
Right. But the output, the actual reduction in global illicit activity, that's much harder to prove directly.
So their defense relies more on a philosophical argument.
It does. The ABA's defense relies on the philosophical truth that strong institutions deter crime, not necessarily on quantifiable metrics that are easily audited by an organization like DOGE.
But they do argue there are tangible benefits.
They argue that these programs create tangible benefits by addressing threats thousands of miles away before they can cross our borders.
That philosophical argument sets up the perfect political clash with an administration focused purely on measurable bottom-line efficiency.
The perfect clash.
This clash of philosophies, soft power versus a hard-line efficiency, is exactly where the conflict ignites. The executive branch made this highly publicized push to freeze all foreign aid.
All of it.
And move USAID's functions directly under the State Department, based entirely on these sweeping recommendations coming out of DOGE.
DOGE was created as a disruptor, and USAID was its primary high-profile target from day one. By early 2025, DOGE had labeled USAID not just inefficient, but a primary target for fraud, waste, and abuse.
And the alleged billions in funding were simply unaccountable.
Right. And this rhetoric wasn't aimed at, incremental budget cuts. This was an institutional declaration of war.
And the language used by DOGE leadership was, it was startling. It seemed almost deliberately provocative.
It was. DOGE leadership specifically referred to USAID as a criminal organization.
A criminal organization.
That it was beyond repair and needed to be shuttered immediately. They claimed the agency was so bloated and decentralized that it was functionally incapable of managing taxpayer money responsibly.
That kind of aggressive zero-sum language was clearly intended to build political consensus for the dramatic executive actions that came next.
Swiftly followed, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the specific details DOGE used to justify this institutional assassination attempt. Because in politics, it's often the specific, shocking anecdote that drives policy change.
That's right.
What were the specific examples they flagged that really resonated with the public?
DOGE zeroed in on spending items that they considered, frivolous, politically motivated, or just a distraction from core humanitarian missions.
Okay.
The report specifically highlighted two examples that got a lot of press. First, $1.5 million spent for DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in Serbia.
$1.5 million. And the second.
And perhaps even more controversial, was $32,000 spent specifically for the production and distribution of transgender comic books in Peru.
Those numbers were absolutely designed to shock the system. They suggest an agency that has completely lost its focus, diverting scarce resources away from, feeding the hungry or providing essential medical supplies, and toward what the executive branch clearly views as radical social engineering.
That was precisely the implication. DOGE argued that these expenditures, while, small in the grand scheme of USAID's multi-billion-dollar budget,
Tiny.
they demonstrated a systemic failure of leadership and priority setting. The narrative was simple. While core aid missions were allegedly failing or suffering shortages, funding was being diverted toward projects that had no quantifiable impact on U.S. security or the physical well-being of foreign populations.
Well, wait a minute. $1.5 million and $32,000 are, they're rounding errors in an agency that manages billions.
Complete rounding errors.
Is the ABA, or the Global Health Council, in the lawsuit, are they arguing that the sheer magnitude of waste cited is so small that it doesn't justify dismantling an entire congressionally established agency?
That is a critical counter-argument within the lawsuit. Yes,
Wow.
The ABA isn't defending the comic books per se, but they are attacking the proportionality of the response. They argue that identifying a handful of small, questionable expenditures does not legally or constitutionally justify the executive branch unilaterally freezing all congressionally appropriated foreign aid funding.
So the remedy is way in excess of the alleged harm.
Far in excess.
And this focus on questionable spending, it directly implicated subcontractors like the ABA through this idea of ghost projects. Can you explain what DOGE meant by that label?
Ghost projects was DOGE's term for funding streams sent to subcontractors, like the ABA, where the final, measurable, on-the-ground impact is either incredibly difficult to verify or, as DOGE alleged, sometimes entirely non-existent.
Because Rowley's work is complex.
Exactly. Training judges, drafting legislation. It's inherently harder to audit than, say, building a road or distributing mosquito nets. DOGE claimed these were ideal mechanisms for fraud because accountability was so murky.
And that scrutiny created an immediate and, potentially fatal dependency crisis for the ABA's rule of law initiative. If Orley's work is hard to measure, it's easy to cut.
Exactly. And sources confirm that the ABA is critically dependent on these funds. Nearly $30 to $50 million of the ABA's annual budget flows directly from USAID and State Department grants for this international work.
$40 to $50 million.
If that funding is instantly cut off, ROLI, its international wing, would not survive. It would collapse. This elevates the conflict far beyond a simple disagreement. For the ABA, this is fundamentally an existential fight for its entire global mission and structure.
So the trigger for the lawsuit wasn't just the investigation or the rhetoric. It was the concrete executive action that forced the ABA's hand.
That action was Executive Order 14169, issued on January 20th, 2025.
Okay.
The administration, acting directly on DOGE's sweeping recommendations, attempted to implement an immediate and universal freeze on all foreign aid funds and initiate the dismantling and merger of USAID's functions into the State Department.
And the ABA immediately called this unprecedented and unlawful.
They did. Their argument hinged on the fact that the administration was seeking to halt funding, even though Congress had explicitly authorized and appropriated the funds for the programs in question for the current fiscal year.
They were effectively trying to legislate by refusing to spend.
Exactly. And that sets the stage for the massive constitutional showdown that is the impoundment battle.
The moment Executive Order 14169 was signed, the ABA transitioned. They went from being a longtime government policy partner and contractor to the primary lead plaintiff in a landmark constitutional lawsuit.
A huge shift.
This is really where the legal theory meets political necessity.
The lawsuit, filed swiftly on February 11th, 2025, was titled Global Health Council et al. V. Trump et al., and it was filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia.
And the ABA made sure they weren't fighting alone.
No, they filed the suit alongside 7 co-plaintiffs. They created a broad front of organizations spanning health, agriculture, democracy development, all of whom faced immediate financial collapse because of the executive order.
And they saw an incredibly quick, yet temporary, legal victory. One that shocked a lot of observers, just given the speed of the court's intervention.
It was a very fast response. Just 2 days later, on February 13th, 2025, U.S. District Judge Amir Ali in Washington, D.C., issued a temporary restraining order, a TRO.
A TRO.
And this TRO was the initial critical intervention that allowed all these foreign assistance programs, including all of the ABA's RLI operations, to continue operating while the core lawsuit proceeded. The judge recognized the immediate, irreparable harm that cutting off these funds would cause.
Not just to the contractors, but to the people they serve globally.
Absolutely.
The speed is just remarkable. What specific action did the TRO take to override an executive order in under 48 hours?
The order contained 2 specific muscular provisions that directly countermanded the executive branch's actions. First, it temporarily blocked the government from suspending, pausing, or otherwise preventing the obligation or disbursement of appropriated foreign assistance funds in connection with any existing contracts, grants, or cooperative agreements that were already in existence as of January 19th, 2025, the day before the order.
That is a direct halt on the financial freeze. It's essentially forcing the government to keep the money pipeline open for existing agreements.
Absolutely. And second, it blocked the government from issuing, implementing, enforcing, or otherwise giving effect to terminations, suspensions, or stop work orders related to those same existing awards.
So the administration couldn't just tell contractors to stop working while they figured out the freeze?
Nope. The court said, you must maintain the status quo until we determine the legality of this action.
This is where we get to the core legal argument. You mentioned this is fundamentally an impoundment battle, which, that sounds like something right out of the Nixon era.
It is.
Let's anchor this in the specific legal framework.
This is the legal foundation of the entire case. Impoundment occurs when the president or the executive branch refuses to spend money that Congress has already legally appropriated for a specific purpose. This practice created massive constitutional crises in the past, most notably when President Nixon used impoundment heavily to dismantle social programs he personally opposed, even after Congress had already funded them.
And Congress responded forcefully to Nixon.
They did, in 1974 by passing the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And this act is the legal anchor for the ABA's case. It severely restricts the president's power to impound funds. It basically states that if the president wants to terminate or delay spending appropriated funds, they have to send a formal request to Congress.
So if the administration wants to cut USAID funding, they can't just do it via executive order. They have to follow the 1974 Act's framework.
Precisely. Under the Act, there are two legal mechanisms for withholding funds: rescissions, which is the permanent cancellation of funds, and deferrals, which are temporary delays.
And both require congressional sign-off.
Both require reporting to Congress, and if Congress doesn't approve a rescission within 45 days, the money must be spent. The ABA's defense argues that Executive Order 14169 was an illegal, unilateral impoundment that circumvented the procedures mandated by the 1974 Act.
So the ABA is essentially acting as a proxy defender of the legislature's constitutional power over the purse.
That's a great way to put it.
They are saying, we might be private contractors, but our contracts represent the expressed will of Congress, and the executive branch is defying that will.
That's the high constitutional ground they are standing on. ABA President Bay has stressed that while the executive absolutely has the right to review programs and set new priorities, those actions must be carried out in compliance with constitutional and statutory requirements.
So this case really tests whether the administration can just bypass the legal framework that Congress created.
Yeah.
Specifically to prevent this kind of executive overreach.
Exactly.
Beyond the principle of spending, the second major front of this defense deals with that real-world tension we touched on earlier. The conflict between operational privacy and DOGE's hyper-focus on accountability.
This is where the idealism of the soft power mission clashes violently with the reality of an efficiency audit. While the ABA is fighting for the legal right to spend the money, DOGE is demanding unprecedented levels of financial accountability in return.
They want line-item audits of every lawyer sent abroad by OLUI.
Every lawyer. Detailing their specific activities, expenses, and potentially even their identities in specific foreign countries.
But wouldn't providing those details, who they are, what specific anti-corruption training they are providing, where they are staying, wouldn't that put those individuals at serious risk? Particularly in places where the legal system is corrupt or even hostile to U.S. influence.
It absolutely would, and the ABA is defending its operational privacy on exactly that basis. They argue that revealing the names and specific sensitive activities of their legal specialists in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they might be actively training judges to prosecute organized crime figures, could genuinely endanger their lives. If their identity and exact mission are immediately exposed through a government audit, their mission is compromised, and they become a target.
So the administration, in the name of transparency and accountability, is asking for information that the ABA argues violates the safety inherent in confidential diplomatic and legal development work. How do you square that circle?
That balance remains the central unsolved policy question. The ABA is essentially telling the court, we must have operational confidentiality to be effective and safe, and we have established protocols for reporting to USA. DOGE's demands exceed reasonable oversight and enter the realm of security compromise.
Because the effectiveness of soft power relies on these specialists being able to work
Quietly and safely, without being treated like overt government spies whose every movement is tracked on a public spreadsheet.
So what's the status of this massive legal fight as of early 2026? Has the initial TRO translated into a long-term resolution?
Not yet. The TRO was quickly converted into more comprehensive preliminary injunctions against the overall aid pause. That was a massive win for the ABA and the co-plaintiffs.
But the administration hasn't given up.
No. They cannot legally block the spending now, so they are using bureaucratic delay tactics. They're initiating aggressive, drawn-out review periods and using administrative hurdles to delay the actual disbursement of the appropriated funds.
The death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts.
Exactly.
So the dollars are authorized by Congress and sanctioned by the court, but the actual flow of cash is being choked off by executive delay tactics.
Precisely. The goal is to keep the pressure on the grantees like the ABA, forcing them to burn through their reserves and slow down operations. Perhaps even forcing them to settle or drop the lawsuit out of financial necessity, even if they are winning the constitutional argument.
What makes this story truly compelling is the evidence suggesting the fight is not contained to foreign policy. The ABA is simultaneously battling the federal government over domestic issues, which leads many observers to conclude there is a targeted, coordinated pattern of retaliation against an organization that dared to sue the executive branch over the impoundment issue.
It creates a powerful narrative of political payback. It really does. When the ABA successfully challenged the administration internationally in February, the government appeared to immediately target the ABA's domestic revenue streams and institutional authority just weeks later.
Okay, let's start with the Department of Justice grant cancellations, which the ABA has framed as a classic case of law firm intimidation.
In April 2025, just 2 months after Judge Ali issued that TRO, the Department of Justice issued a directive known as the Blanche Memo.
The Blanche Memo.
And this was a clear signal to cut off taxpayer funds that were flowing to the ABA's various domestic public service programs.
What justification did the DOJ give for suddenly terminating these long-standing domestic grants that had nothing to do with rule of law work in Kazakhstan?
The administration alleged that the move was necessary because the ABA supported what they called activist causes.
Activist causes.
Citing the ABA's history of defending specific immigration rights litigation positions, and, most tellingly, specifically mentioning their current litigation position against the administration in the Global Health Council lawsuit.
So the ABA immediately viewed this not as policy review, but as blatant retaliation.
Blatant retaliation for exercising their legal right to challenge the executive order on USAID.
This is a classic example of targeting unrelated revenue streams to increase pressure. They didn't just go after the ROI money, they went after programs that are politically hard to cut.
They targeted grants completely separate from the international rule of law work. Most notably, those funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW.
Wow.
These grants are used for critical domestic services, often funding legal aid for victims of domestic abuse. By cutting OVW funding, the government maximized the institutional pain and damaged the ABA's public reputation as a defender of justice. It increased the political impact of the punishment.
So the ABA's legal counterattack here has to rely on the First Amendment, right? They're alleging viewpoint discrimination.
Yes.
How does that legal theory apply to government grants?
It's a powerful argument rooted in free speech law. The ABA is suing to restore the OVW grants, alleging that the government is unconstitutionally punishing them for their political speech, specifically their decision to file a lawsuit against the executive branch.
The argument being that legal organizations have to have the right to challenge the government.
Exactly. They, like any nonprofit, argue they must have the right to challenge government policy or advocate on sensitive issues without the state weaponizing the federal grant system to strip away unrelated, vital funding.
And the legal standard here is quite high, isn't it? I mean, the government has some discretion over who receives taxpayer funds, but it can't use that discretion to silence political opponents.
Exactly. The ABA is leveraging Supreme Court precedent that states the government cannot condition receipt of a benefit, like a grant, on the recipient foregoing their constitutional rights,
including freedom of speech and the right to petition the government.
Right. So the central legal question becomes, was the Blanche Memo's decision a legitimate administrative efficiency measure, or was it a punitive measure aimed solely at punishing a specific viewpoint?
The viewpoint that challenged Executive Order 14169.
Yes. And the timing strongly suggests the latter.
That's a crucial defense, not just for the ABA, but really for any nonprofit that relies on government funding, yet needs to maintain its independence and advocate on constitutional issues.
It tests the line between accountability and coercion in government funding. It really forces a determination on whether the executive branch is using its economic power to enforce ideological conformity among its contractors.
Okay, now let's turn to the second massive domestic threat the ABA is facing simultaneously. This one hits at the absolute heart of their institutional power.
The loss of the accreditation monopoly.
The accreditation monopoly.
This is a long-standing, simmering point of friction that is now just boiling over into legislative action in multiple states. Historically, the ABA has acted as the sole gatekeeper of legal education in the U.S.
Right. To sit for the bar exam in nearly every state, you must have graduated from an ABA-accredited law school,
which gives them enormous, almost monarchical influence over curriculum, tuition rates, and law school policy.
That monopoly is the source of their institutional strength, their influence, and their revenue.
And it's also their source of vulnerability. For years, critics, conservative think tanks, reform-minded state legislators, even some schools have argued that the ABA has abused this accreditation power.
How so?
They claim the ABA has used its gatekeeper role to enforce DEI mandates, specific curriculum requirements, and other ideological criteria on law schools.
And these criteria allegedly drove costs up while limiting institutional freedom.
Freedom to adopt innovative or alternative curricula, exactly.
This political critique has now translated into unprecedented legislative action, fracturing that authority. And Texas was the first domino to fall.
It was. As of January 2026, the fracturing of this authority is a clear sign that the ABA is besieged on multiple fronts. Texas, a massive and historically pivotal state for legal education, became the first to officially end the ABA's oversight of law school accreditation within its borders.
What specific legislative arguments or bills were used in Texas to achieve this monumental shift?
The Texas legislative effort centered on what they call ideological neutrality bills. These proposals specifically targeted the ABA's accreditation standards, arguing that they required Texas law schools to adopt politically charged DEI language or curricular mandates that violated state principles of academic freedom and non-discrimination.
So the Texas legislation essentially established a new state-based certification process.
Exactly. It allows law schools to achieve full Texas accreditation and thus allow graduates to sit for the bar without the ABA's sign-off.
That's a massive tectonic shift in the legal landscape. It means the ABA's accreditation becomes optional within Texas.
It severely weakens the ABA's institutional clout, and the move is spreading. Sources indicate that Florida and Ohio are currently debating similar legislation.
Wow.
And these bills are explicitly aimed at creating state-sponsored, ideologically neutral accreditation alternatives. It would effectively allow state governments to certify the quality of legal education without deferring to the ABA standards, which the state governments view as politically compromised.
So if we step back, the ABA is now fighting on three separate high-stakes fronts simultaneously.
Three fronts.
Defending its foreign funding in federal court, defending its domestic grants as a First Amendment issue, and defending its institutional monopoly against state secession movements in Texas, Florida, and Ohio.
It is truly the ultimate defensive crouch. And the unifying philosophical thread across all these conflicts is the ABA's central argument that changes to policy, whether it's the funding of foreign aid or the standards for legal education, must follow established legal and constitutional procedures.
So they're challenging actions they see as being carried out by executive decree.
Or political retaliation or ideological legislation rather than through due process and compliance with the rule of law. They are fighting for procedural integrity in a highly politicized environment.
This deep dive has revealed the American Bar Association in an extraordinary, even precarious position. They are no longer just the legal establishment.
No.
They are now the activist defender of institutional norms, engaged in a pitched battle across three crucial fronts that collectively define their future.
First, they are fighting for financial survival, just trying to protect that $40 to $50 million in annual USAID funding that's essential for the survival of their rule of law initiative and their whole global mission.
Second, they are leading a crucial constitutional defense, championing the landmark lawsuit against executive impoundment of appropriated funds. By invoking the 1974 Impoundment Control Act, they are acting as a key defender of Congress's fundamental power over the nation's spending.
And third, they are engaged in a major institutional defense. fighting back against alleged viewpoint discrimination that stripped their DOJ grants, while simultaneously battling a multi-state effort in Texas, Florida, and Ohio aimed at dismantling their decades-long monopoly on legal education accreditation.
What's truly insightful about this entire saga is the broader implication. When we look at the actions of executive branch officials attempting to freeze and dismantle Foreign Assistance Program's actions, the ABA rightly calls unprecedented. We are witnessing how deeply private, traditionally conservative organizations are sometimes forced to step in to defend the very constitutional framework itself.
It links the health of global markets and the export of the rule of law abroad directly back to the health and integrity of our domestic legal structures, especially the separation of powers. The U.S. can only successfully export the ideal of democratic governance if our own system is seen to be operating legally and predictably. If an executive order can unilaterally bypass Congress on spending based on ideological disagreement, the entire system of checks and balances, which the ABA depends on to enforce its rules and policies, is undermined.
So this case becomes a battle for institutional predictability in a time of maximal political disruption.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive. If the ABA successfully defends the separation of powers and restores its funding, they still face that massive operational and ethical challenge presented by DOGE's philosophy.
Right.
How does the government effectively balance the inevitable demand for transparency, line item audits and public accountability, with the absolute operational need to protect legal specialists who are working under the flag of soft power in highly hostile countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo?
The ability for an administration to set new policy priorities without violating the law remains intact, but the question is how. The balance between hyper-accountability and effective, safe diplomacy remains the central unsolved policy question that this case, even in victory, will leave hanging over the ABA's operations for years to come.
Something vital to mull over until our next deep dives. Thanks for joining us.